Tonight, we begin a journey that stretches back over 4,000 years. We are traveling to the quiet, dark heart of a holiday known today for plastic pumpkins and chocolate wrappers, but which began as something far more profound, far more terrifying, and infinitely more silent. We are traveling to the complete, unabridged history of Halloween. If you listen closely, you can almost hear the faint rustle of dry leaves in a Celtic wind, the soft glow of a dying fire, and the gentle rhythm of history unfolding, slowly. We speak of Halloween, but the story we tell began long before that word ever existed. It is the story of a threshold. Every year, as the long summer exhales its last breath, the human mind instinctively recognizes a moment of transition. The world moves from warmth to cold, from life to barren earth, from harvest to hibernation. This moment of passage is what gives Halloween its true power. It is the idea that the boundary between our ordinary waking world and the shadowy, mysterious world of the dead, of the spiritual and of the unknown, that boundary becomes incredibly thin. We call this idea the thinning veil. Think of it not as a solid wall, but as a fabric. For most of the year, this veil is thick, keeping the two worlds securely separated. But on one night, at the hinge of the calendar, that fabric becomes threadbare. The air grows softer, yes, but also a little more charged. Conversations fade not just into whispers, but into listening. Even your own heartbeat sounds louder, because in the quiet, primal part of your mind, you sense that you might not be alone. This delicate, peaceful hush didn't appear by accident. It has a story, beginning thousands of years ago in a world ruled by the seasons, where every night was truly dark and every sound carried the weight of survival. Tonight, we will explore how this night, this singular transition, came to be one of humanity's most enduring, celebrated, and occasionally feared traditions.
Purification. The smoke was believed to purify the land and protect the cattle that remained. Warding off. The size and light of the fire were intended to scare off any lingering negative spirits before winter set in. Rebirth. Most importantly, the fire symbolized the death of the old year and the birth of the new. Once the Druids' fire had burned down to glowing embers, every member of the community would take a small torch, light it from the holy embers, and carry that flame back, in silence, to their own home. It was a profound, symbolic act of connection and renewal. That small, blessed flame would be used to relight the hearth and keep the family alive through the dark months ahead. So, when we think of Halloween, we are thinking of a deep history of fire, agriculture, and the quiet, necessary sacrifice that guarantees survival. This was not a holiday of costumes. It was a night of life and death stakes determined by the fate of the harvest. And in that profound silence of the extinguished fires, the veil between worlds truly began.
This brings us to the first true reason for costuming, which was a necessity born of fear, not fun. If a human were outside on the night of Samhain, they had to be unrecognizable. They needed a disguise. To blend in, one theory suggests people would wear drab, dark clothing or cover their faces with soot or mud, the earliest form of guising. The goal was simple: look like a wandering spirit or an Aos Sí yourself. If you blended in, you might pass unnoticed. To appease. Another theory suggests some dressed up specifically as the spirits or monsters they feared. This was an attempt at ritual mimicry or appeasement. By looking like a fearsome spirit, perhaps you could trick a real spirit into believing you were one of them, or perhaps scare them off. The ancestors. The most comforting reason was the belief that the souls of the ancestors were returning home. To welcome them, families would set out a feast, a dumb supper, and leave an empty place at the table. If you were a person moving between houses, perhaps seeking shelter or food, dressing up ensured that the family you approached would mistake you for a wandering ancestor and treat you with respect, offering you a share of their feast. This practice of wandering between houses, offering a rhyme or a gesture in exchange for food, is the direct, quiet ancestor of our modern trick-or-treat. But it started not with candy, but with a plea for survival, wrapped in the fearful disguise of a creature from the other side of the veil. The quiet logic of the Celts was this: on the night when the law of the world breaks down, you must either
Apples and nuts, the emphasis of Pomona's feast, brought fruits and nuts into the seasonal traditions. These became central to games, divination, and feasting. Think of bobbing for apples. This act is a form of scrying or fortune-telling that was adopted from the Roman focus on the orchard goddess. You try to catch an apple floating in the water without using your hands. The number of attempts or the manner in which you succeed was said to predict your future spouse or luck. Games and feasting. The Roman emphasis on communal feasting and lighter games helped shift the focus of the night from pure fear to mixed celebration. The night was still sacred, but now it could also be social. The Roman influence was less about a clash of armies and more about a quiet, persistent blurring of traditions. The Celts didn't stop celebrating Samhain, but they began to include the Romans' apples, nuts, and calmer harvest games. So as the Roman Empire slowly began to crumble, it left behind an enduring legacy. It had taken a terrifying spiritual night of the dead and added a touch of civilized, seasonal cheer. The seed of a holiday for fun, not just for survival, had been planted. With the collapse of the Roman Empire, Europe descended into the early Middle Ages, a chaotic, noisy, and fearful time. The one structure that remained powerful, organized, and pervasive was the growing Christian church. The church faced a significant problem: how to convert populations that stubbornly clung to their ancient, earth-based seasonal festivals like Samhain. These holidays were too deeply embedded in the rhythm of life to simply ban. The church's solution was a masterful act of strategic, spiritual absorption. They didn't destroy the pagan calendar, they rebaptized it. This process is known as syncretism. It's the quiet, methodical merging of two different religious traditions. The strategy was to move the church's most important feast for the dead and saints directly onto the most powerful night of the pagan calendar. The key dates were established by the papacy: All Saints' Day, or All Hallows Mass, or All Hallow Mass. This day, dedicated to honoring all the Christian saints who did not have their own specific day, was moved by Pope Gregory IV in the 800s to November 1st. All Souls' Day, dedicated to commemorating the faithful departed, all Christians who had died. This was established on November 2nd. The crucial piece of the puzzle, and the birth of our name, was the night before All Hallows. The tone was one of solemnity and charity, not mischief. It was the opposite of demanding a trick. It was simply an earnest exchange, a prayer for a cake. It was a spiritual contract, quietly fulfilled in the deepening twilight of the medieval year. The act of souling would survive in various forms for centuries, fading and reviving, until it crossed the ocean and transformed into the boisterous candy-filled ritual we know today. But remember, at its heart, trick-or-treat began with a quiet, charitable plea for the dead. While the church succeeded in creating a pious structure for remembering the dead, it struggled to eliminate the ancient folk magic that was deeply tied to the night the veil thinned. In the late medieval period and through the Renaissance, the atmosphere around Hallows Eve grew considerably darker and more dangerous. This period was marked by the terrifying phenomenon known as the witch panic.
the church and secular authorities began to actively persecute and criminalize folk magic and anything that smacked of pagan survival. Samhain, or Hallowtide, became a crucial night for this fear because many of the folk traditions practiced on this night were inherently about divination or fortune-telling, predicting the future using magical means. Scrying. The games with apples and nuts that the Romans introduced took on a menacing edge. Young women would try to predict the name or appearance of their future husbands by peeling an apple in one continuous strip. The strip's shape would form the first letter, or by placing nuts on the fire. If the nuts burned together, the couple would marry. If they popped apart, the relationship was doomed. These were the silent, desperate rituals of a pre-modern world, done in the quiet corners of the home. But under the shadow of the witch panic, these acts of harmless folk tradition were interpreted as consorting with the devil. The bonfires, once used for purification, now took on an ominous purpose. They were seen not just as places of light, but as sites of execution, driving the fear of the dark powers further into the popular imagination. This era taught the people of Europe that the magical aspects of the season were not merely dangerous spirits, but dangerous ideas. The quiet traditions of divination and folk magic were driven underground, surviving in whispers and dark jokes, ready to resurface when the persecution eased. The darkness of Halloween, therefore, has two distinct histories: the ancient spiritual fear of the other world, and the very real human terror of persecution during the age of the witch trials. If you were to take a deep breath and jump across the Atlantic Ocean, say to the shores of 17th century colonial America, you would find something remarkable about the great harvest season. Halloween was missing. It simply did not exist. This absence,
The shared space. Unlike the isolated, strict Puritan settlements, the burgeoning American cities were becoming cultural melting pots. German immigrants brought harvest festivals, African slaves brought ancestral rituals, and the Irish and Scottish brought Hallowtide. This forced blending allowed the quiet Irish rituals to interact with and eventually influence the larger American environment. Community cohesion. Halloween became a way for these immigrant groups to maintain cultural identity and social cohesion in a strange new land. The parties and games were familiar, comforting anchors in a world of industrial noise and urban hardship. Initially, Halloween was a small, localized affair, a whisper in the tenements and close-quarters communities. But as these communities grew and integrated, their celebrations began to spill out onto the streets. This was the quiet, determined return of the Night of the Dead. The pagan seeds, dormant for generations in the new soil of America, finally found the warmth of shared culture and began to sprout again, leading to perhaps the most iconic American change to the holiday, the crafting of the jack-o'-lantern. When the Irish and Scottish immigrants brought their Hallowtide traditions to America, they brought the custom of carving a lantern to ward off malevolent spirits or to represent the lost souls of the dead. But in the Old World, they didn't carve pumpkins. They carved the available root vegetables, the turnip or the large potato. If you look at historical images of carved turnips, they are difficult, dense, and yield small, often terrifyingly grotesque faces. The carving process was arduous, the light minimal. When the immigrants arrived in America, they discovered a native vegetable that was abundant, soft, easy to carve, and offered a grand canvas, the pumpkin. This seemingly small agricultural swap was one of the most important, quiet steps in the Americanization of the holiday. Ease of creation. The pumpkin transformed the carving process from a difficult chore into a joyful communal activity. Suddenly, the eerie lantern could be much larger, much brighter, and much more expressive. The legend of Jack. This custom quickly merged with a European folktale, specifically an Irish one, about a lazy, drunken man named Stingy Jack who tricked the devil. When Jack died, he was denied entry to both heaven and hell. The devil supposedly tossed him an ember from the fires of hell, which Jack placed inside a carved turnip to light his endless, lonely wanderings between worlds. The resulting figure became known as Jack of...
The Victorians quietly stripped the holiday of its existential dread, dressing it up in lace and good manners, making it palatable for the emerging American middle class. This paved the way for the chaos that was soon to follow. The quiet, structured social parties of the Victorian era did not last long. As the U.S. entered the Great Depression and Prohibition eras in the 1920s and 30s, the holiday's energy was redirected toward vandalism and mischief. Halloween became known as Gate Night, Mischief Night, or Cabbage Night, a night of organized, community-wide pranking. This was not the quiet, polite fun of bobbing for apples. This was loud, destructive chaos. The pranks escalated from tipping over outhouses and soaping windows to serious acts of vandalism, cutting down trees, setting fires, smashing streetlights, and stringing wire across streets. The context. The Depression created a desperate atmosphere where social order was fraying. The children and teens who committed these pranks often came from poor communities, and the acts were a frustrated, anonymous rebellion against authority and property owners. By the early 1930s, the destruction was so widespread and expensive that cities across America began a quiet panic. Authorities feared they would lose control of the night entirely. Halloween was becoming a menace. This crisis led directly to the invention of organized trick-or-treat as we know it today. Community leaders, librarians, civic groups, and parents realized they couldn't stop the mischief. The strategy had to be to contain and redirect it. The plan was simple. Offer an organized, sanctioned activity that was more immediately rewarding than destruction. The pitch? Go door to door, perform a harmless trick, a short rhyme or song, and receive a treat. The goal. The aim was explicitly to keep children off the streets and out of trouble. By giving children a structured, charitable purpose, the hope was to defuse the destructive energy of the night. This campaign was slow and deliberate. The earliest known uses of the phrase trick-or-treat in American newspapers appeared in the mid-1930s, often framed as a solution to vandalism. It took until after World War II, when sugar rationing ended and the baby boom population was ready to participate, for trick-or-treat to truly take hold. The birth of modern trick-or-treat, therefore, is a quiet triumph of social engineering, a successful attempt to swap anarchy for candy, and destruction for a new organized ritual of the modern American community. The age of mischief was finally contained. With the end of World War II, America entered an era of suburban expansion, mass media, and unprecedented consumerism. This new environment was perfectly suited to transform Halloween from a quaint folk tradition into a massive multi-million-dollar industry. The 1950s and 60s provided the necessary ingredients for Halloween's explosive growth. The baby boom. A massive population of children meant an equally massive audience for organized trick-or-treating. Television and media. Cheap plastic costumes and masks based on popular TV shows, superheroes, and horror icons began to be mass-marketed. The individual, homemade costume gave way to the quiet uniformity of the packaged costume from the drugstore shelf. The suburban design. The standardized, safe, and easily walkable streets of the post-war suburbs were ideal for the ritualistic, linear process of trick-or-treating. Kids could safely traverse blocks, easily recognized and welcomed by neighbors. The rise of the mass...
Simultaneously, the satanic panic of the 1980s further complicated the holiday. Fueled by televised talk shows and unsubstantiated claims, some Americans became convinced that Halloween was a high holy day for Satanists and cults, leading to genuine,
if unfounded fear about animal sacrifice and dark rituals. This moral panic, much like the Puritan resistance centuries before, forced another quiet retreat. Churches and parents sought to replace the traditional costumes, witches,